Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to our first Methods Hub seminar of the year. I'm delighted that we have Professor Guy Abel with us today. As many of you already know, Professor Abel recently joined us at HKU a few months ago. He is a statistical demographer, a social statistician, and he's done a lot of great work on migration data for getting better estimates of migration data. And prior to joining us at HKU, he was at the Asian Demographic Research Institute at Shanghai University, and also has a position with IELTS, this International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. For those of you who are in the social sciences, the systems research is a really important big topic area about which we often don't know very much about. So I'm really glad that Guy can lend us some of his expertise there as well. He's also worked as a consultant for Facebook, the International Organization for Migration, the International Labour Organization, and the World Bank. And I think he's going to be talking to us about some of this work he's been doing with all these esteemed institutions. So thank you very much, Guy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's nice to see so many people here to hopefully try and give you a kind of overview on the landscape of quantifying international migration. So I really started working on this topic after my PhD. Well, during my PhD, I was looking at migration within Europe, that there are lots of sort of freedom within Europe, but there's also kind of like a freedom in the way that we can't record very well within Europe how many people are moving between countries, because essentially you can just cross the border without your passport, and it's kind of difficult to quantify. And then after that, after my PhD, I moved to Vienna, where they have a big group working on sort of global demography. And so as part of that, they do population projections, and they needed migration inputs into that, because the sort of evidence base for migration, the actual quantifying the numbers of people moving in and out of countries, as we'll see, it doesn't really exist. So we need to use sort of statistical methods or some kind of mathematical methods to try and impute. So in this talk, I'll go in a bit more detail, but I'll go through a couple of sort of papers, let's say, that I've worked on or working on. The first is working with Professor Joel Cohen, who's based mainly at Rockefeller University in New York and Columbia. And then later on, more recently, I've been working with a team at Facebook, Data for Good, and Drew as well is also working with us, who's at Harvard. They are on trying to use more direct methods to estimate migration, to using Facebook activity. So just to try to motivate this idea of quantifying international migration, that official data on migration flows are mostly missing. If you go across like the 200 odd countries, maybe 50 of them might have some kind of report on the number of migrants maybe coming in, maybe not so many on those going out. And it's highly biased towards countries that are kind of rich and Western, especially European, and then maybe outside, a few in East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and North America. But those are countries that sort of have enough money essentially to develop a statistical infrastructure to record or some way trace how many people are coming in and leaving the country. And even some of the most developed countries are not doing that very well. They're like relying on surveys, whereas migration is quite a rare event essentially. So you might not always be able to pick them up accurately with survey data. So when we think about a global level, when we think about global demography, then if we've only got like a quarter or so countries reporting migration data, they might be reporting them to different definitions, then that really restricts our analysis of international migration patterns and trends, which makes it difficult to do sort of the basics of monitoring, setting policies, and then the more sort of complicated things of social scientists in developing theories for international migration. We're really restricted to analyzing the countries where we have the data, and more difficult to test and make the theories robust outside of these handful of countries. So that's been reflected in a few sort of high-level agreements. So in the SDGs, migrants are mentioned in a few parts, and better data for migrants. But that was more fleshed out a bit more in the Global Compact of Migration that came a few years later to follow up the SDGs for the migration community. And so they set, I think it was 15 goals for better, sort of more policy-orientated goals towards migration, of which the first one was better migration data, both in the stocks and flows, and thinking about the characteristics of migrants to better enable the enactment of policies. So as I go through the talk, we'll see there's different sides of migration, right? Different things that we can measure when we talk about migration. And one of the biggest contributions into the sort of migration data literature has been from, well, first the World Bank, but then the UN. They've begun since 2013 to publish data on migrant populations. So they sort of can build this migration matrix, we call it, with the origins and the destinations on the rows, on the columns, where the origins are the countries of birth and the destinations of the country of residence. So for each country, they have an estimate, for example, in Hong Kong, of how many British-born people there are, and for all combinations of 200 countries of birth and 200 countries of residence. And that data is mainly based on censuses, in some countries, population registers, and they also include refugee data where it's required, and they can kind of build this matrix to sort of show the different distributions of populations each where in each country. So it's not perfect by all means, but it's a brilliant insight to sort of the levels of migration data, the level of migrants, the population of migrants and their locations. But in essence, it's this form of data called stock data. So I'm going to talk about flows and stocks as a common sort of demographic perspective, that we'll have stock data that sort of tells us at a specific point of time what the population is. And then the flow data is what we're going to derive from it. And that's really the movement, how many people in a given period have joined or left the population, in this case, via migration. So this stock data, that's sort of easier to collect than flow data, because we can get it from censuses just by asking them at a specific point of time, what's your country of birth? And once you've replied, it's not going to change, right? It's sort of a fixed characteristic. So we can sort of get some idea of the global level of migration. So the UN data is highly quoted, and all sort of the UN agencies, they always talk about rising numbers of migrants. It's always coming from this original data collected by the population division from these data sources. But of course, what is really another side of this sort of question on migration, on quantifying migration, is really the flow data. So that's what we're going to look at in this talk, and that's really referring over a period of time how many people have moved, not how many people are currently there, but how many, like in the last 5 years, how many people came into the country, how many people left. So that's a different type of data than the stock data, which is the number of migrants at a specific point of time, rather than over a period. So each have to have their uses, of course, but the flow data, from my perspective, so working previously in Vienna, when we were doing projections, we would need flow data to do projections. We need to know in our base data and our future assumptions, how many people are going to come in and out of the country. That's the flow data. The stock data is not so useful for doing these sort of demographic projections. And also flow data sort of refers to the contemporary pattern. So a stock of a data, like a British person in Hong Kong, they could have moved like a few months ago, like myself, or they could have moved 20 years ago. It tells us nothing about the timing of the migration. It's the flow data is really telling us, in the last 5 years, how many people came in and out. That's really, we can see how policies are being impacted, and the relationship with migration. Okay, so like I said, I'll kind of go through these two separate kind of bits of work that overlap a little bit, but they're essentially methods to estimate these flows between all countries, so the origins and the destinations. And you can sort of slice these in two ways. One is that indirect methods, and the second is the direct methods. So in the indirect methods, we use the changes from the UN stock data to try and infer what the flows must be to match the changes in the migrant populations. So these provide some sort of baseline into the patterns and trends that have been used in these global population projections with the group of demographers in Vienna in particular. And then a second is looking at these direct methods that I'll talk about perhaps in the later third or quarter of today, where we talk about using actual observed people from Facebook data, trying to see people across countries And so rather than looking sort of indirectly, we're sort of using observed data to try and weight them and get them representative at a global level on the level of migration. Okay, so first off, we'll go through these indirect flow methods and essentially concentrate on this paper that Joel and I worked on, which reviewed 6 global migration flow estimations and methods. So these are really based on these changes in the UN origin destination migrant stock data. And yeah, as I probably said before, these are sort of addressing 2 shortcomings. So previously, these methods have been developed since 2013 when the UN came out with their data. There was a sort of 4 or 5 different methods being proposed, but all of them use sort of different inputs, different versions of the UN or the World Bank data. So there was sort of no clear systematic comparison of the different methods. And so what we tried to do in that paper was bring all the methods together with the latest data to try and build up a comprehensive set of estimates that are sort of benchmarked to the same set of data. And then also there have been like limited validation, where people were proposing these estimation methods without really sort of giving any comprehensive summary of why that method is better than the other method, right? So here we wanted to sort of build a battery of tests to say, okay, we can compare on different measures or against the different methods to try and get a handle on which one might be more realistic. So these 6 estimation methods could be categorized into 3 broad categories. The stock differencing, which there's a couple done by economists, migration rates done by Adam Dennett at UCL, and then the demographic accounting approaches that I proposed back in 2013, but then had been extended by Zozi and Rafti at the University of Washington. So I won't go into like all the equations behind it, let's say, but I just created some dummy data to hopefully give you a feel of what's going on with the tables, what's going on with the data and how these estimates, indirect estimates are being obtained. So essentially, we start off with the input data from the UN, which of course is like 200 by 200 countries. So origins and places of birthplaces and places of residence. And we might have it at time T, which might be say 2000, and then 5 years later, or the next period, at the end of the next period, which might be 2005, for example. And then we might see like this might be the people born in country A, but living in country B is 10, and then we see it's decreased to 5, right? So that decrease, it must be because something's going on demographically. So either it could be some deaths, or it could be some migration, or it could be both, right? So this is what we're trying to infer indirectly from the changes. And usually when the data is published, we don't get these diagonal entries, which are the people born in A, living in A, right? The native born population. They only record the foreign born populations there. So some of the most basic methods that have been used in very like well-cited papers by economists, they take this stock data and then they sort of subtract the sort of end of the period from the start of the period in each cell, in each combination of foreign-born populations to work out the stock difference and to sort of infer that as a flow. And they sort of stop there and they build very complicated econometric models based on this measure of the flow as their response variable. And sort of my feeling was always that's a bit of a kind of big assumption to make, especially when the stock goes down, then you can't really get a negative flow, right? And they don't want to model a negative flow, so they'll end up just setting it to 0 and saying there was no flow when the stock went down. So that's just to give you an example of here all the flows went up. So here from the number of people born in A, living in C was 10, and it went up to 15. So at the end, they get a flow of 5. Yeah. And where it went down, where we noted it before, 80 to 75, rather than put -5 in there, they just say it's 0. So a very simple approach that we wanted to show perhaps was providing less accurate estimates in the validation test later on. Okay, so in a more complicated approach is to sort of rather than treat the negative changes as zeros, is to reverse the flow, to say that they're return migrants. So they're going back across the reflection of the diagonal to back to their home country. So in that way, you get higher sort of volume of flows and slightly different directionalities going on. But rather than go through the equation, we can sort of show again, this is where they increased, and in the red, this is where they decreased. So here we see it went down by 5, So then we add 5 in the opposite diagonal. So here we get 5 in here, where previously it was a 0. So this is sort of a second approach, again, very simple, but used in quite highly cited papers by economists, where they build very complicated things about unemployment rates and GDP and incomes on the right-hand side of the model, but they're using quite a basic measure for the flow, the thing that they're trying to explain as the response variable in the equation. Okay, and this third approach was proposed by Adam Dennett, where essentially kind of a very simplistic approach where he sort of divides the whole of the stock table by the total stocks and says, like, this is kind of a rate of flow that's going on by using the stocks as the proxy for the rate. And then he scales all these sort of rates up by a global M, which is the global amount of migration, which we don't know, but he says we can approximate this using the absolute net migration flows from the sum of the absolute net migration flows from the UN. So the UN does provide net migration estimates for all countries, but nothing else beyond, like a kind of matrix format where you could tell where they're going to or from. So just to give you an example, there's the stocks matrix at the start of the period again. Then he divides everything by 420 here. So he gets these kind of rates going through into each country each year, sort of assuming the flows are working as the stocks are distributed. And then he takes the net migration from the UN, takes the absolute of that 70, and then he's going to sort of multiply this inside of the table by 70 to get the flows out here. So again, it's quite a basic approach, but it had been used a bit in internal migration literature. So and without not doing too badly in internal migration. So we wanted to sort of test this approach at the international level. And then the next 3 sets of approaches are these demographic accounting approaches, which sort of I first developed. And essentially they rely on this sort of a method to match known margin totals, known sort of row and column totals in those tables, based on this imputation method called iterative proportional fitting procedure, which has many different names in different fields. Perhaps you've heard of some of these: raking, entropy minimization, multi-proportional adjustments, and so on. So the idea behind it is that you might have a table that's been used in multiple disciplines. So you might have a table like this, might be in census, and then maybe later on you might know the total ins and outs coming to and from an origin destination. So you want to sort of scale this the cells of the matrices to match these targets totals. So you sort of use this IPF method where essentially, we're going to impute these values here. So we're going to scale, in the case of 5/6 and 1/6, the value of 16. So that's 13.33 is what 5/6 of 16, and 1/6 of 16 is 2.67. So you do the scalings first for the columns in this case. You see the rows are a bit off. So then you use 13.33 divided by 8.22 times by 18 to hit that target. You sort of go across the rows, down the columns, across the rows, down the columns, and so on. And eventually it will iterate to get to a linear convergence to get to the targets within some tolerance, right? So you set your tolerance to quite a small level, let the computer sort of iterate through to get the values out. And of course, the stock data that I showed you before is not in this format, right? But this is the tool that I use. I just want to explain it simply before we sort of expand up the stock tables to get into a similar format. Okay. So in this 2013 paper, I sort of showed that we could redefine these stock tables here as essentially this situation where we have birthplace specific flow tables where we know the origin and the destination margins. So if you consider what we have with the stock tables from the UN, then what are the column totals in this form? They are the total foreign-born population in each place. And the diagonal elements, as I said before, that they're not usually given, but they are the native-born populations. So we can fill that in, right? Because the UN also provide total populations. So in that case, we could work out, given the total population, we can work out what the native-born population is from the remainder of the foreign-born. And then we can put those into the diagonal. And now the column totals are now the total resident population at the time of the census, or at the start of the period and the end of the period. So we sort of have kind of global demographic account in the way that everyone's counted here when we have these 200 by 200 tables for every country is in there. And then we can think, well, what are the row sums in this case? The row sums here are the sum of people ever born in country A, country B, C, and D. Yeah. So this won't change over time if you think about it. If there's no, well, what the difference is, yeah, let's say these are sort of constant across time in a world where there's no births or deaths, right? You can't change your birthplace, right? Once it's been given, it's sort of a fixed characteristic. So if there was, in this simple situation that I set up, where I try to ignore the fact that there's births and deaths, then we could consider that people would move across the columns, essentially, right? They're distributing themselves across the columns between the start and the end of the period. This is how we're getting different numbers across these different colors, because people are moving across the columns. They can't move down the rows, right? They can't change their birthplace. So, so then I started to think about this two sets of tables as really one table, but in multiple dimensions. So in fact, this is really like our origin distribution, and this is a destination distribution. And then we sort of need to work out how many moves are working out between the two to get them into the format. So you can see this is here a transformation of the previous data, where this was the origin distribution on the left, and this was the destination distribution on the right. So I'll go back, yeah, maybe. So you see what 100, 10, 10, and then we've got 95, 5, 15, 5, and you can see, and they work out here. Then this got me into the format that I worked on previously in internal migration, where I see like these margins, and I know this IPF algorithm, and I think, okay, I must be able to apply this somewhere to fill in the matrix and to get something perhaps that will help estimate the flows that are going to match these stock margins in there, including the native born populations. Okay, so of course, like I think I first ran an IPF and I got like really crazy numbers out. And that's because there's sort of two types of missingness going on there. So there's the non-diagonal elements that are the people that are changing their origin and destination. But then there's also the diagonal elements that are the non-movers that are staying there. So in each of these sort of cells of the array, these are people born in A, living in A at the start of the period, and living in A at the end of the period. Whereas this is born in A, started in B, and now living in A. So there's sort of two different types of data going on, which means I sort of had to adjust the sort of off-the-shelf algorithm to fill these in. So the first sort of method I proposed, just to set these diagonal elements to their maximum values. You know, generally in international migration is quite a rare event, although we're in like a very international city. If you go to like the population giants like India and China, the chances that you're going to meet international migrants gets very low. So I wanted to sort of set that quite a big sort of inertia and set those to the highest possible values. Then I adapted the algorithm to sort of count those diagonals as fixed, as well as the margins. And then later on, in this PNAS paper, Rafferty, they used a sort of pseudo-Bayesian approach, they labeled it, where they use a sort of a mixture of the maximum values that I just talked about, and also sort of the independence values, where you sort of would fit the algorithm as is off the shelf. And they would weight this, they came up with this weight of 0.87 based on comparisons to estimates of European migration flows, to come up with this weighting, but applied it globally. So maybe it's a bit easier to see in the tables. So with the fixing the maximum values for the diagonals, you can see in each cell, I would just go down and we'll say, for example, this cell is 180, because if it went any higher, then it would sort of violate the row total here. If it's 181, then it wouldn't work out. I could put it to a lower, 179, but that was where I was stuck. I was thinking, how low do I go? Because the lower it goes in the diagonals, then the higher it becomes in the off diagonals, which are the migration flows. So I used to just set them to the maximum values, thinking this is like a kind of naive approach. Later on, it's relaxed by the Rafferty extension. So every cell we go through, say like 5, this couldn't be 6 because it would violate the sort of fixed margin total here. And so we would just go through. And then I could adapt the algorithm to fill in the values here. So for example, we had 5 spare on this row, so it goes 2.25 to get to this sum of 100. and also later on. So you can see here it's a bit more neatly weighted, so you get a bit more, it takes a little bit longer for the algorithm to converge there. So the second approach was by Rafty, where they just fit the algorithm as is. They don't respect the diagonal or the non-diagonal in the first half of their approach. So it's really like an independence fit, essentially, that you might get in a Python regression model. So they sort of fit an origin, destination, and variable columns to variables to them. And so you sort of see it spread out a lot more. There's a lot more in the off diagonal than the diagonal. So this is essentially in the world where there's no friction to movement, there's no borders essentially, and or there's no barriers to migration, and everyone can move about without any cost. So this is really where they have, they take that, what do they call it? This ZIJ, which is this independence thing, and they weight that with 0.13 is the weight. 0.87 is the weight from the minimization approach. So there's minimization approaches, gives this estimate of the flows, tables. So essentially to get that, let's say 7.9, I'll go back and show you how we got that. Which cell was it? A to C, 7.9. So that's the 2.5 plus the 0 plus the 0 plus the 5.4. So you just sum over the birthplace of the over all the tables and just focus on the origin and destinations part of the array to get out the final table for the minimization. And then the straight Bayesian approach takes 0.87 of that approach and then 0.13 of the similar summation over the independence model. Okay, so one of the sort of thing I scudded over was that these methods require, in demographic accounting, require the row totals of the migrant stock data to equal. So that worked in that dummy data where I didn't assume there were any births or deaths. Of course, when it's a lot messier when you get with the real data, and we have to account for these changes from births and deaths. So sort of propose this accounting system to take care of that. So for the births, it was quite easy that the births are taken away from the native born population. So that's always in the diagonal. And we get the number of births from the UN for every country and the number of deaths. So the number of births we can just take away from the diagonal at the end of the period. And the number of deaths we take away at the start of the period. So we're not factoring them into the migration estimation. But we only get the total number of deaths per country. So we just use a sort of a very simple assumption, perhaps too simple, is that the number of deaths sort of weighted equally across, not weighted in proportion to the migrant populations in each country. That doesn't lead those row totals to match, but it gets them a lot closer. So then in a later paper, we sort of came up with an additional step, essentially to rescale the data so the row sums match at their midpoint. It's probably too complicated to get into and a bit more boring tables. But this had a really nice feature that when you come out with the estimated flows, when you do this sort of rescaling, that the estimated flows from the table, when you sum them all up, they match the net migration from the UN. Sort of matches their demographic accounting system, just breaks everything down by origin and destinations. So it provides a lot more value. Okay, so in this paper, we applied all those 6 methods that I showed you, to estimate the migration flows in these 6 periods between 1990 and 95 to 2015 to 2020. And that's based on the UN stock data that comes out in these 5-year intervals. So we get 5-year flows out, making the differences between the 5-year intervals. So that's, they're published 7 sort of periods, time points sort of by the UN. And then in a later paper, we've expanded that to get sex-specific flows that I won't go into. But essentially the UN, whilst they provide the total stocks, they also provide the male and female stocks as well. And you can work out the births and deaths of males and to also estimate them. So to give you an idea of what comes out, we developed these chord diagrams for migration. So they've been used a lot in genetics, but we started to apply them to migration. So essentially you have these sectors, as we call them, they're for different regions, world regions. And then we have here the tick marks are in millions of people, migrants. And then we provide this chord that shows, so for example, we've got just over 4 million migrants estimated here come out of Latin America and the Caribbean and go into North America. We applied this right to the 200 by 200 countries, just to show difficult to fit in like one core diagram. So we just aggregate them up to these 11 regions here. So this is what Latin America to North America, and then we have a small return flow of a few million, and then this is the flows within sub-Saharan Africa. So they're changing country, like Ghana to Ivory Coast, for example, that's contained in this sub-Saharan African flow. So we can fill these in and get an idea of the global migration dynamics over this sort of long period. So this is, from 90 to 95. So we can see already, like in Europe and North America, we get a big diversity of flows coming from all over, whereas in other regions like sub-Saharan Africa, sparsely dominated by flows within the region. Same with Central Europe and East America, Central Asia and Eastern Europe, for example. I guess Hong Kong's down here in East Asia, so we see a lot of outflows to North America, mainly Chinese. Okay, so we can animate this over time. So this is 1990 to 95, and then we can see this is the total migration flow that we've estimated. So it sort of stays similar in the next period. And then 2000 to 2005, we start to see sort of an expansion of moves into West Asia will come. So especially in this 2005, so this is a lot of South Asians moving to West Asia, to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates for construction, and also Southeast Asians, I guess, going in there a bit, and expansion of migration into Europe and North America. And then later on, we'll see like big moves within West Asia. So this is sort of Syrians moving out to neighboring countries, to Lebanon, to Turkey. And then later on, a big increase in Latin American moves. So it's Venezuelans moving again to countries within the region predominantly. So you can see at the end of the period, with the latest estimate, we get just over 101 million. This is using the Pseudo-Bayesian method. So global number of migrants moving within the 5 years at the end of the period. Yeah, like I said, we could break this down by females and males. So I just show you the differences there is mainly at the bottom here. There's a lot more males going from South Asia to West Asia. So that we're picking up from the differences in the stocks essentially. Yeah, so we get 50 million males and 46.1 million female migrants. So it kind of gives us this first glimpse that we've been using in projection models in Vienna, essentially to help as baseline data to help projecting forward migration. So just some summaries. This is the total flow over time. So what I showed you in the plot before was this red line that flows from this method, the Pseudo-Bayesian. And we also have these different methods, and you can see there's a real big range in these different methods. So these stock differencing approaches are giving us around like 40, 35 million migrants, whereas we get 101 from the Pseudo-Bayesian. So a big range. So it's still like a very emerging field, I would say. Lots to do to perhaps get a big handle. And this is the rate here. So this was an interesting finding when we first did it. You can see this is essentially this number on the left divided by the global population. So we can see we're getting around 12 in 1,000 migrants estimated to move every 5 year. 12 in 1,000 people, sorry, estimated to move every 5 year period. So it's still quite a rare event, regardless of which method we use. But I guess what's interesting is that it's fairly constant. So there's a big narrative about the increase in migrants, global migration becoming a bigger factor. When you scale in global population, I mean, there's more migrants, but there's more people. So when you divide by the people, the population, then we're getting sort of just fluctuations around a constant, perhaps even decreasing if we use this migration rates approach in the number of migrations globally. Okay, so yeah, one part of this paper was that we really wanted to say which method is best. So how do we go about doing that? So we compared the estimates with a range of data sets, data collections. So, for example, the UN used to publish some data collections on migration flows that they took from questionnaires that they sent out to national statistics offices. In Europe, Eurostat requires EU members, their statistical officers, to report immigration and emigration flows to the Eurostat, to the statistical office of the European Commission. There's also been academics. So there's a group at Oxford that collected migration flow data, again, going through yearbooks and so on from different countries. So we worked on that. And then we were at the problem where well, we could compare the rate of migration or the count of migration. And we thought if we're going to model a migration, we probably want to model the log of migration. Or perhaps if we're doing projections, we're really worried about the immigration rate or the emigration rate or the net migration. So we thought there's just a bunch of migration variables that we're really interested in, or potential users might be interested in. And so how do we do this comparison for, well, we sort of did the comparison for multiple measures, and then we sort of were stuck with the problem that we were these 5-year flow estimates because of the gaps in the stock data that we're using as inputs. But all the reported data was usually 1-year data. So they were reporting just for 2018 or 2019. And then they all had different definitions of what counts as a migrant. Some countries, like Germany, when you go to Germany, you need to register usually with the local authority in order to get a mobile phone or get gas or electricity in your house. So sort of that's how they base their migration statistics, on this registration data. So it's usually a very quick sort of thing. As soon as you get there, you're going to register, and then you're counted as a migrant. Whereas in the UK, they count it on you on a requirement that you intend to stay in the country for 12 months. So you could see this definition has a sort of fairly big impact on the level of migration, and maybe even the relative sizes from each origin and destination. So what we did, we multiplied the average of the annual flows that we were getting by 5 to try and get somewhere close to a 5-year flow. But we weren't looking for like a perfect correlation. We would assume if it was perfect, then something's probably going wrong. But we just sort of used that to, and we used, this correlation to avoid thinking about the levels, but just looking at sort of the respective closeness of the reported data to the estimated data. So we're calling this like a bronze standard comparison. So we're not expecting the perfect correlation. So this is the result of the test, right? We have our 6 migration measures: the count, the log of the count, the sort of share of the matrix of the origin destination flow, the immigration rate, then the net count. And we have these different data sources. So DEMIC was a project run by Professor Hein de Haas at Oxford, who's now moved to Amsterdam, but he collected data from lots of different countries. Eurostat, that I talked about, the UN old collection in 2015, and also the UN have the net migration. So different collections have different measures in them. And then these are our different estimation methods. So in general, we found, these demographic accounting approaches, we're getting sort of higher correlations across them, especially this Swede-Bayesian method. And all, sort of all had a bit of a weakness with the emigration rates. Tends to be the weakest measure going in there. So just a summary, I guess, we sort of quantified global migration over the last 30 years. This validation exercise was indicating this Swede-Bayesian approach was perhaps giving the best estimate. I think we sort of guided that perhaps that's at the upper end of the feasible limit on global migration flows. So as you might have noticed, they use this weighting in there that's sort of calibrated on European migration flows, and they apply that weight globally. So obviously there's sort of higher migration within Europe because of the freedom of movement between most countries, and then applying that so weight elsewhere is probably let's say optimistic. So as I said before as well, there's a large range in the levels of the flows. So depending when people have started to use these estimates, we sort of recommend which measure they're using, then look across the measures and for the highest correlation to choose which estimates that they might be interested in. And perhaps you can do some robustness by running different estimates from the different methods to give you a bit of a better feeling of your analysis using the migration data. And another big point is that there are a lot of sort of when we look through the flows, then there's definitely flows that don't make sense. And that's essentially an artifact of the fact that we're putting together UN stock data and UN demographic data, population births and deaths. And although they come from the same team in the UN, there's probably different sub-teams, and I don't think there's a lot of checking going on. So this sort of dates back to this idea of a demographic account that was talked about a lot in the early 80s about trying to build demographic accounts to check our demographic data against each other, something that economists do quite well, but demographers, we don't. And so estimating the flows is actually quite a good way to do that, because you find a funny flow I can always tend to like drill down and see that's because the population data is too high or too low. That's because the stock data has not changed as much as we know it has, and the UN hasn't picked up on that because of inconsistencies in however they're doing it. Okay, and then we built this website. It came out last year. So this is like these interactive chord diagrams. So you can go through these estimated flows. So you can sort of overleaf it, and then you can click on different periods, choose the different methods, and expand. You can see the country specific. We're revising this perhaps to make it a little simpler. Take out as too many flows. Perhaps it can be a bit slow to load. We have the sex specific estimates in there, and you can also look at the stock data in there as well. So, and you can download all the data and code from there as well. And then that's the paper, and the code and data are all on Figshare. If you want to use the data, or just send me an email, I can send them to you. Okay, so the last sort of third, last 15 minutes, but perhaps I can talk about these direct estimates. So this is led by Wang He at Facebook. So the idea is that they're going to release this public access for free data on quarterly migration flow estimates between all countries. And the data is going to start in January 2019. At the moment, we're like sending the paper out for trying to get it published. So I think once we've got like some publication thing in process, then they're going to release the data for everybody to access. And it's based on a massive data set of 3 billion sort of de-identified users, user population. So these are people that are using Facebook at least once a month. And then we've built this method to try and estimate the migration flows based on these observations. So there's sort of, I think, 5 steps to it. The first is sort of taking something that's like internal to Facebook, as still a bit of a black box to the team that I'm working with there, but they have this home prediction algorithm where for every user, they are able to predict the country of residence. In fact, they can go down a bit further than that, but it's based on the IP address where the users are. It's bunch of factors: the IP address, where they say they are, perhaps in their profile, where their activity is, maybe they're checking in different places, maybe where their friends are checking in, groups that they're joining. So all these things could have, in a bit of a black box, are built into an algorithm that's internal within Facebook to detect where people are located. And we just take that from de-identified users. All we see is the predicted location that we're not even sure is 100% accurate for every user. And we get this kind of timeline where perhaps in these black dots, these are the days that they're using Facebook. Some days they're not using it, some days they are. So we can build these segments in the second step, where we might see over time, this user, for example, might have been in location 4, they might have gone to a different country for a couple of days, back and forth, maybe a holiday here, and then they switched. So in most users, they're staying in the same place, right? But the vast majority of this 3 billion, but we get sort of interesting patterns sometimes where we think there might be it's probably a migration going on here. We see them logging in a completely different place consistently over time. We see a switch. And so, we're really trying to adopt this UN definition which is recommended that you see a person spends a majority of a year in one place, and then the next year they spend the majority of the time in a different country. So over 6 of the 12 months, they switch. So we could apply any definition of migration really and try and work out what the migration level would, but we adapted from this UN definition for detecting the migration levels. And then once we had done that for all 3 billion users, then we aggregate that up to the country level. So we work out how many people are moving between the countries. And then we have this big problem that the Facebook population doesn't represent the global population. So we went through this sort of weighting of the flows to account for variation in the Facebook usage across countries. So to do this, we built a model based on the economic characteristics, the migration characteristics, and the Facebook usage. So we try to account for the fact that in poorer countries, wealthier individuals are both more likely to use Facebook and more likely to migrate. So we built that into our weighting model. So then we end up predicting a sort of hopefully representative picture of migration where we've controlled for these different exposures or usage of Facebook. And then the last step was to add noise. So we used this differential privacy algorithm to essentially replace, especially when we have small numbers, we replace them randomly by another number that's also small, but just adds this extra disclosure part of that's required to release the data, essentially, to protect the privacy. So the estimates are able to produce monthly, or I think we're going to release quarterly, but we're able to build up these migration flow chord diagrams again. So we see slightly different patterns, but fairly similar to what we were getting with the 5-year flows. We got in 2019 around 29 million migrants within the year. And then we were able to track this through COVID, which was like a really interesting period. We could see this big dip in global migration around April, maybe even March in 2020, and then this rise to a little bit higher than before, perhaps to make up. We're still tracking this to see whether it's going to go down. The thing is, we have to wait for the end of the year sort of thing to see. We sort of have to work out the migration definition. You sort of have to look both the last year and the current year. So we'll have to wait out the current year to see where people have stayed for the majority of the time. So we're always sort of going to be 1 year behind them. And then the validation, we sort of went through the similar measures as we did in the previous, as I've done in the previous work, where we've gone through all the different measures. But we really concentrated at the first layer, let's say, against New Zealand and Sweden. These two countries have sort of the best, well, some of the best migration statistics in the world. New Zealand, because they're sort of scanning every passport as you come in. And they're publishing migration statistics monthly, which is quite rare, but we can match that with our monthly estimates from Facebook. And Sweden, because they have the population register. So again, it's a very comprehensive system where they're sort of collecting very good data on migration and freely releasing it all. So you can see we get really high correlations going on here. And this is against the Eurostat collection, so slightly looser. But again, the Eurostat data is based on a wide range of definitions. So we weren't expecting perfection in this case. And then the nice thing here is we can track over time. So this is, for example, is from India to New Zealand. Pretty much every flow into New Zealand that they publish, we're getting very similar sort of tracking of the reported migration flow by Stats New Zealand against the Facebook estimation. And we also sort of compared it against the 5-year flow estimates of the Swedish region, and a bit lower correlation, I think it was around 0.85 or something like that. But, you know, we're comparing 5-year and 1-year flow estimates. So again, it's probably going to be a bit different. So yeah, hopefully the data will be released this year if we can get the paper published quickly. So the data covers 177 countries. So that's around 79% of the population. We didn't include China because of the problems with using Facebook in China. But that's not to say we, in the supplementary materials as we have it now, we do have an additional data set with China in. So we're able to build up a different weighting method for the China data. So, I mean, I used to live in China and I could still use Facebook via VPN. A lot of students that I had were on Facebook, like friending me. And we can sort of compare the Facebook estimates that they do have for China against reported data coming into Europe from China and going to China as well. So we built like this extra add-on to the data that includes China and covers then nearly 100% of the world population. Yeah, and the great thing about this data is just, you know, it's based on actual observations, whereas before it's all indirect stuff. And we can produce it a lot higher frequency than, so more frequent. And so I think it's a lot more sort of going to give a lot more accurate estimates than differences from the stock. One thing I probably should have mentioned is that we're also building different data sets of shorter term migration. So we were working with the IOM. They wanted stuff about Ukraine. So rather than having this 12-month definition of migration, we shrunk it down to like 6 months, because we can get sort of quicker estimates of migration flows out for that. So hopefully this data will be out soon and we can share and we can all use. And that's all. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Hao Han. I'm from the PPA department. So I'm asking as a complete amateur to demographies. So my first question directly follow up with your methods description is really fantastic, but I keep thinking about the bias that it might contain given the data source, because that it's using the publicly reported location data. So I've been thinking of scenarios, and I know that you do the reweighting, which can really alleviate the problem. But I still think like there are two sources of bias that I'm thinking about, and not sure if I'm sure you have thought about it. The first one is are there countries where Facebook are really unpopular or is seldom used? So in the sense so extremely unpopular so that the weighting scheme doesn't work that well, like the data scarcity in those countries. I'm thinking about maybe like China would be one example, and maybe some of the less developed country, would that be the case? And then the second source of biasness would be, so undocumented migrants or illegal immigration, they might be afraid of sharing publicly that they moved, and then would that be a concern leading to some underestimation of these cases? And then, so the second very short question is, in one of the slides, if I understand correctly, different methods shows slightly different patterns of the immigration. So, which methods would you say is the most accurate and most is the most accurate one? And I know you have a matrix where you compare with something. So is there some gold standard that you compare all the results of these methods to? Yeah, so that's
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Sure. Great questions. So for Facebook, like where beyond China, where it might not be used. So there are definitely countries that I don't think will be covered. North Korea, I think Afghanistan. Like Facebook has a list of countries that it sort of sees as sensitive, and I don't think it wants to publish any data on it. So they are sort of definitely not in the paper, and I don't think we even calculated for them. And when we were doing this weighting, then yeah, it was an iteration. We worked a long time on this, trying to account for these different factors. So I think we came up with like the best sort of solution that we could get to, where we accounted for these different income levels. That was sort of the key breakthrough. I think before we were doing stuff by just demographics for like age and sex structures of the Facebook population compared to the real population, and we were getting sort of crazy weights basically. But when we started using the income type way to weight, then we got a lot more sensible estimates. They were matching a lot better against the official reported data. So that was sort of, I think, sort of a key to it. I'm sure it's not perfect, and it's sort of the same model in every country, with some country-specific, how do you say, controls. But I'm sure it could be improved with more time, perhaps. But I think at the moment it doesn't do a bad job. I think it's especially like where we can really trust the data, the Sweden, the New Zealand, for example, it looks really good. So it'd be nice if there was like a developing country that had really good migration data. We could look in a different setting, but it doesn't exist. So unfortunately, we can't get to that. The second point was about the undocumented migration. So in that, I think it will pick them up if they're using Facebook, because it's picking up in the IP address. And then of course, that perhaps brings in that moral issue of whether we should be somehow excluding that. But I think there's no way to do that, because we don't know from Facebook, they don't know if they're illegal or not, really, just from that unidentified de-anonymized sort of anonymized sort of location history that we get from the internal algorithm. But at the end, I mean, I think that's part of the motivation for doing that disclosure control, adding in that randomness, so you can never really trace a particular. If it was just an estimate of one person moving between the two countries, then you wouldn't be able to. You won't be able to rely on that value as one. It's a simulated one based on the fact that it's a low value. Yeah, and then the last bit was about a gold standard. So I think at the global level, there's no gold standard. I think the Facebook data is probably way better than the indirect estimates that I showed in the first half of the talk, just because it's based on that observation. It's covering 3 billion people. That's a large chunk of the population. And whereas the stock data, sometimes they're from censuses that haven't been updated, and the UN have just sort of imputed the numbers through some very basic interpolations. I think there's lots of ways that estimates could be improved by going into the input data, the stock data, and the demographic data. But then it's always seemed like a bit of a pointless task competing with the UN, bringing up another set of stock data. It doesn't seem worth it. But yeah, I think the real gold standard is in the countries. Like I said, New Zealand, Sweden, there's So even Korea has really good data as well, South Korea. So the data is at the country level, but at the global level, it's it's a great area for statisticians to play in because it's just so much missing data and yeah, tough to really determine any gold standard at the global level though.
So continuing on the question about undocumented migrants, I'm just mentioning that's where the official data is going to be not full standard, but
Yeah.
very poor, but potentially you Facebook data might get a better estimate of undocumented people. So I'm just wondering whether in future research you might think about looking at specific groups that are more have a propensity to become undocumented migrants and getting better estimates than official data.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think we already sent like pre-release of the data to IOM. They were super interested in the Ukraine and Venezuela. And in the paper as well, we did something on Hong Kong as well, Hong Kong migrants to the UK and solving these crises, and Myanmar as well. So we're able to pick that up. You can really see the big outflows and the big inflows in like Colombia and neighboring countries. So I think, yeah, it does provide that different part of the story. And I think we're always trying to stress that it's not like it's never going to replace the official data. I mean, the official data are definitely required and you can't take over. You see these social media websites, they come and go. So you can't rely on this, but it definitely helps in the picture of things in providing a different data point where we're in a very data poor environment, really, for many countries. So definitely has some use to it.
Asking for the same kind of data.
I haven't, no, but I did work with a former student. He worked at Tencent, so the company that operate WeChat. So they do have data, but the discussion is always they want to sell the data, right? So they want you to write. They might give you the paper, but then you sort of need to how to say it? It's kind of tricky. Like where I never was able to get my hands on the data because there was also some kind of negotiation of you need to write a paper, publish in a high impact journal showing how great this data is, and then without seeing the data, it was always difficult to access, especially as a non-Chinese. So I think it's possible to get that internally within China, but then I don't know. I think WeChat, they talked about, they did have data overseas as well. And the good thing about some of those services, they're used quite a lot in the Middle East, or even the servers, so they can pick it up. But it's definitely like a big area to explore these other data suppliers. Yeah, but for working with Facebook, I didn't contact them. They contact me. I think they've seen the previous paper about the validation stuff, so I was really helping them with the validation part of it. And so I think there's always a trade-off with the companies on. I mean, I do know people like in Southampton at WorldPop, they will go to the companies and say, we can show a really good like public health use of your data. So we can liaise with you, and they have lots of experience doing that. So I think it is an avenue for researchers that you can go down, but it takes a bit of expertise in getting used to how to do that negotiation. Yeah, so it's a bit of an interplay.
Thank you so much for the great talk. So recently, Facebook's monthly active users has started like dropping for the first time ever. Do you think this has any potential effect on like future data?
I'm sure it will in the long run. Yeah, I'm sure you can see Facebook fading. I mean, it used to be like 10, 15 years ago, the first sort of papers on digital demography, we call it, on migration, were using Yahoo data, log in from Yahoo, and then see how much use would that sort of method be now. So I think the people that work on digital demography, they tend to stress the importance of the companies and the platforms might come and go, but it's not to invalidate the data for their time. And sure, it might not be great in 10, 15 years, but it gives us a glimpse now. And maybe there's a next Facebook that we can start to work with. We can see with Facebook as well, they're taking over Instagram and over there, they're covering this well, WhatsApp. So you can always, either they're growing somehow or moving along somehow, and you can try and follow them or follow the new one that pops up.
Thank you.
So for both the direct and indirect estimation methods, are you able to add uncertainties for your estimates?
Yeah, I think, you can. In the indirect ones, we can, because it's all through this IPF, sort of essentially like a fitting of a Poisson regression model. So you could, in fact, add in that uncertainty, and then the direct one, I'm sure we could build, like we have the model behind the weighting, so we could do that. But then there's these black boxes that come with on the location that have no. In each of them, I guess there's components where we could add in the uncertainty, but it wouldn't cover the uncertainty for the whole method. It would just be maybe combining from parts of the method. So it's possible to add it in. But yeah, when I've done I've worked on population projections a bit, when you add in the uncertainty, everyone just takes the median anyway, right? So it's always it's a lot of extra work for you're not sure how much uptake there would be of that uncertainty level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'm curious about what other social data sources that can be used in a similar fashion. For example, when you just now talk about Hong Kong to UK migration or Hong Kong to Canada, I noticed that a lot of content on, say, YouTube channels, like there's a boom of YouTubers or so-called influencers who talk about how they decide to migrate to certain regions of UK, how they compare, what are the considerations like real estate or education for the children, this and that. Are these possible directions for potential researchers who are interested in the regional level of research on Hong Kong immigrants? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's just this explosion of sources that we can measure migration from now, with beyond the traditional data sources. Now we have these new ways to quantify. So I think in the so far in digital demography with migration, we have these sort of direct data where you have contact with the like Facebook or the data, you work with the teams there, and you can sort of track through the individual users, through the algorithms to quantify. Or the second way is sort of through their advertising platforms. So so a lot of these companies like Facebook, even Google, LinkedIn, you can go on there for free, say, I want to create an advert, for example, Hong Kong expats in the UK, and it will tell you, or even in London or something, and it will tell you, there's 20,000 people there, and then you can check back the next month, maybe there's 21,000. So you sort of trace these over time. You sort of keep scraping the websites, and you can sort of see how the patterns in the changing through the advertising platforms. So there's these two main channels, but then maybe there's again, indirect methods through these partial information, through YouTube videos, Twitter posts people use for migration intention data. So it's lots to explore.
Section.
Yeah.
Very, very. They know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Not shy to share.
YouTube comments. Yeah. Notorious.
Hi. Regarding the data about Facebook, I wonder, is there any ethical concerns when you use the IP address as a proxy for the locations?
Yeah, I think so. That's like another group in Facebook, another internal group that then handed it off to the Data for Good team. And from my understanding, there's not a perfect knowledge within Facebook on how they're doing that sort of black box algorithm to produce it, but it certainly isn't just the IP address. And also the IP address is how do we say, it's not always correct, right? When you use a VPN, your IP address is going to be off, right? So it's a whole bunch of things on the way you're checking in, where your friends are, your new friends, which groups you're joining. So it's a whole mishmash of things. So it's never how good it is, I have no idea, but I guess they're probably using it in their advertising platform. So it probably forms a big part of their monetization part. So I'm sure it's fairly good. I mean, one thing I would say when I started working with Facebook, you have to sign like a whole bunch of contracts, and a lot of things go through lawyers. I mean, it's kind of very American style that I was sort of a bit surprised by, but I feel like they, for this project, they had to go through a big ethical board to set up the project. And we were talking about trying to do subnational things. And it seems like, you know, have to go through it each time they want to do a project in the Data for Good team. So I feel like it's all sort of considered in that part of the process.
Thank you.
So in the patterns you'll find, what do you think is the most interesting or counterintuitive or patterns that maybe previously data would not able to reveal?
Yeah, I think the big thing is always the scale of migration from South Asia to West Asia, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India to Qatar and Saudi. I mean, we know about it, but like when you put those volumes of flows in context with flows into Europe, and then the daily conversation about migration in Europe is about, you know, in terms like thousands rather than hundreds of thousands of people coming, that it is there, then that always struck me that it's sort of like an under-discussed part of the migration research. I think you will see like, you know, hundreds of papers each year in migration research on like flows from Latin America to the US to Canada. But the migration going on between, you know, South Asia and West Asia, I think is just completely, it's in the narrative, but I don't think it's as big as it should be. And we should be just the volumes of people. That's what struck me at the first, and the sex balance, the gender balance in that flow as well is surprising. Not surprising, but it's so big there, whereas everywhere else it's kind of balanced. There it's so unbalanced. It sort of distinguishes itself in that form. Yeah.
Your data visualizations are so beautiful.
Yeah, that's built up over the years. So the core diagrams was based on an R package called Circleize. So it was done by a biostatistician, and then just through GitHub, I was like pushing him to modify it to look better for migration. So yeah, the guy there, in the end, I ended up, I have a package, R package called MIGEST, MIGEST. So you can just run it in one line of code now. Just use the function to produce these. You give it the matrix and it will produce the plot for you. Then the interactive stuff, I was working with the data visualization specialist. That's all done in D3. It's like a JavaScript library. So that is too complicated for me. But yeah, it's got all the tooltips and stuff. It's, yeah, thanks.
Now I wonder if the purpose of migration is also accounted for, like migrant labor. What pops to my mind is that the Filipino and Indonesian domestic helpers in Hong Kong, many of them also had worked in Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, other countries. Are these accounted for in this research method?
Yeah, I think in both the direct and indirect, they should be picked up. If they're taken into account in the censuses, then they should be in the indirect methods. And if they're using Facebook, and then it will be picked up from their location information, the IP address, or the friends that their networks as well. So I think in both cases, they should be picked up, perhaps not perfectly, but there should be some component of that. I mean, you could see in the like the Southeast Asian flow to West Asia. So you can see the gender balance skews female. So you have a lot of domestic workers in Qatar and UAE, for example, that are coming from those parts of the world as well. I haven't checked so much in Hong Kong. Yeah, I should check that. Yeah.